He was just a struggling single dad carrying groceries up the stairs of his rundown apartment building. But when he heard the screech of tires and saw the elegantly dressed woman lying motionless on the asphalt outside, something in his young companion's urgent whisper made him drop everything and dial 3 numbers that would save a stranger's life and transform both of their worlds forever. Ronan Sheffield had no idea that the bleeding woman he was desperately trying to keep conscious was Aurelia Croft, the ruthless real estate mogul who owned every brick of the building he called home, the same woman who had been planning to evict half the tenants that very week. Sometimes it's not the grand gestures that change everything, but the split-second choice to care for someone when no one else will. If stories of unexpected connections, second chances, and the power of compassion in the darkest moments speak to your heart, don't forget to subscribe. You won't want to miss how one emergency call turned a landlord and tenant into something neither of them saw coming. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the grimy windows of Brookstone Apartments, a 6-story brick building that had seen better decades. Paint peeled from the hallways like old skin, and the elevator worked only on days when the superintendent felt generous enough to call the repair company. But for Ronan Sheffield, it was home, the only home he could afford on a night shift. Security guard salary in the heart of Millbrook Heights. Ronan climbed the narrow stairwell to the 4th floor, grocery bags cutting into his palms, his work boots echoing against cracked concrete steps. At 28, he carried himself with the quiet exhaustion of someone who had learned to expect little from life, but demand everything of himself. His dark hair needed a cut, his jeans were worn thin at the knees, and his flannel shirt bore the faint scent of industrial cleaning supplies from his overnight shift at the downtown office complex. Behind him, 10 steps back as always, followed Oliver Finch. At 11 years old, Oliver was small for his age, with sandy hair that refused to stay combed and eyes that seemed to absorb everything around him like a camera capturing details others missed. He wasn't Ronan's son by blood, but he was his son in every way that mattered. 3 years ago, when Oliver's grandmother, Ronan's next-door neighbor and the closest thing to family either of them, had passed away in her sleep, Ronan had made a choice that surprised everyone, including himself. He'd become Oliver's guardian, transforming from a solitary man who spoke to no one into someone who packed school lunches and attended parent-teacher conferences with the same dedication he'd once reserved for his own survival. The lady in 2B was crying again last night, Oliver said quietly as they reached the 3rd-floor landing. He had a way of noticing things, sounds through thin walls, the way people's shoulders hunched when they carried invisible weight, the difference between tears of sadness and tears of fear. Ronan paused, shifting the grocery bags. "You sure?" Oliver nodded. "Different crying than before." "Scared crying." Mrs. Chun in 2B was a widow in her 70s who worked 2 part-time jobs to afford the rent that seemed to increase every few months. Ronan made a mental note to check on her later, maybe bring her some of the soup he was planning to make. In a building where most tenants kept their doors locked and their problems private, Oliver had somehow become their unofficial emotional barometer, sensing distress through walls and closed doors with an accuracy that both amazed and worried. Ronan. They reached the 4th floor, where the hallway smelled of decades-old carpet and the faint aroma of different families cooking different meals. Ronan's apartment, 4C, sat between Mrs. Rodriguez's place, where telenovelas played at volumes that suggested hearing aids, needed adjustment, and the empty unit 4D that had been vacant for 2 months since the last tenant couldn't keep up with the rising rent. As Ronan fumbled for his keys, Oliver pressed his ear against the door of 4D. "Someone's been inside," he whispered. "What do you mean?" "It smells different, like expensive perfume and business." Ronan raised an eyebrow. Oliver's sensory observations were often strange, but they were rarely wrong. Still, the apartment had been empty for weeks, and the building's management company, Croft Holdings, rarely bothered to show units properly. Most prospective tenants took one look at the water stains on the ceiling and the temperamental heating system and decided to look elsewhere. Their own apartment was small but clean. A one-bedroom that Ronan had converted into a two-bedroom by hanging heavy curtains around the living room couch where he slept each night. Oliver's room was barely larger than a closet, but Ronan had painted it blue and filled it with books from garage sales and library discards. The walls were covered with Oliver's drawings, intricate sketches of buildings, people, and imaginary worlds that seemed to flow from his pencil without conscious thought. "Homework first," Ronan said as they entered, setting the groceries on the small kitchen counter that doubled as their dining table. Oliver nodded and disappeared behind his curtain, where Ronan could hear him arranging his notebooks with the precise organization that helped him navigate a world that often felt too loud, too fast, too unpredictable. The boy had arrived in Ronan's life like a quiet storm, bringing with him a sensitivity that made everyday life both more complicated and infinitely more meaningful. As Ronan unpacked groceries, generic cereal, day-old bread, and the ingredients for a soup that would last them 3 days, he thought about the notice that had appeared under every tenant's door last week. Croft Holdings was evaluating the property for modernization opportunities. Translated from corporate speak, it meant rent increases, possibly evictions, maybe even demolition. The building's residents lived with the constant anxiety of gentrification creeping through their neighborhood like slow-moving floodwater. Ronan had grown up in foster care, moving from home to home until he aged out of the system at 18. He'd learned early that stability was something you created, not something you were given. This apartment wasn't much, but it was theirs. Oliver had a school he liked, friends in the building, a routine that helped him feel safe. The thought of losing it made Ronan's chest tighten with a familiar panic, the same feeling he'd had as a kid every time social workers arrived with garbage bags for his belongings. From behind the curtain, Oliver's voice drifted out. "Ronan? The lady from 2B is walking past our door. She's going upstairs." Ronan moved to the window and peered down at the street below. It was nearly 4 o'clock, the time when the neighborhood shifted from day workers heading home to evening shift workers heading out. The building's front entrance faced a busy street where food trucks gathered around the subway entrance and street vendors sold everything from phone chargers to flowers wrapped in newspaper. That's when he saw her, a woman in an expensive charcoal suit was stepping out of a sleek black sedan, her heels clicking against the sidewalk with the confident rhythm of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. Her dark hair was pulled back in a perfect chignon, and even from 4 stories up, Ronan could see the gleam of jewelry that probably cost more than his annual rent. She carried herself with the posture of power, shoulders back, chin up, eyes scanning the building's facade. Like a general surveying a battlefield. She was beautiful in the way that money could make anyone beautiful. Perfectly groomed, expensively dressed, radiating the kind of confidence that came from never having to choose between heating bills and groceries. But there was something else in her expression as she looked up at the building, something that might have been calculation, or assessment, or the cool evaluation of someone deciding which parts of other people's lives were worth preserving. "She's coming inside," Oliver said quietly from beside him. Ronan turned to find the boy standing at the window, his small face pressed against the glass. Oliver had a way of appearing silently, like a cat or a shadow. "Who is she?" Oliver asked. Ronan shrugged. "Probably another real estate developer. They've been circling this place like vultures." But something about the woman's purposeful stride, the way she'd studied the building's exterior, made Ronan uneasy. This wasn't a casual viewing or a quick inspection. This felt like someone coming to claim what was already theirs. As if responding to his thoughts, Oliver said quietly. "She's not here to look. She's here to decide." The words hung in the air like a prediction, and Ronan felt that familiar knot of anxiety tighten in his stomach. Whatever this woman's business was with Brookstone Apartments, he had the distinct feeling that life as they knew it was about to change. The next morning arrived gray and drizzling, the kind of October weather that made everything feel dampened and subdued. Ronan had worked his overnight shift at the Meridian Plaza office complex, spending 8 hours walking empty hallways and monitoring security cameras that showed nothing more exciting than late-night cleaning crews and the occasional raccoon testing the building's trash receptacles. He'd returned home at 7, grabbed 3 hours of sleep, and was now preparing to walk Oliver to school before heading to his second job, weekend maintenance work for a small property management company that paid cash and asked no questions about irregular schedules. Oliver sat at their small kitchen table, methodically eating cereal while reading a library book about urban architecture. He had a way of focusing that was both impressive and slightly unsettling. When something captured his attention, the rest of the world seemed to fade into background noise. This morning, however, Ronan noticed the boy's usual concentration was interrupted by frequent glances toward the window. "Everything okay?" Ronan asked, pulling on his jacket and checking that Oliver's backpack contained all the necessary supplies for a successful day of 5th grade. Preparing and narrating. This story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Oliver set down his spoon and looked up with the serious expression he wore when processing something important. "The woman from yesterday. She's different than the others." "Different how?" "The real estate people who come here. They look at the building like it's broken, and they're deciding whether to fix it or throw it away," Oliver explained, his young voice carrying an observation skills that sometimes made Ronan forget he was talking to an 11-year-old, but she looked at it like she already owns it. Ronan paused in his morning routine. Oliver's insights about people were often startlingly accurate, a skill that Ronan attributed to the boy's years of living with his grandmother, who had taught him to read the subtle signs of mood and intention that others missed. When you're small and dependent on the adults around you, you learn to predict storms before they arrive. "Maybe she's just more confident than the others," Ronan suggested, though something about Oliver's observation resonated with his own unease from the previous day. Oliver shook his head. "It's not confidence. It's single quotes ownership. Like when you come home and check that everything is where you left it. Except she was checking that everything is where she wants it to be." Before Ronan could respond, the sound of raised voices echoed through the thin walls from the hallway. They looked at each other for a moment, then moved quietly to the door. Ronan pressed his ear against the wood while Oliver crouched down to peer through the gap beneath. "Telling you, Mrs. Chun, these rent increases are necessary to maintain the property standards that our residents expect." The voice was crisp, professional, and unmistakably female. Ronan recognized it immediately as belonging to someone accustomed to having their words treated as final pronouncements rather than opening statements for negotiation. "Can't afford another $200 a month," Mrs. Chun's trembling voice replied. "I'm already working 60 hours a week. Where am I supposed to find more money? Perhaps it's time to consider whether this building is the right fit for your current lifestyle needs." The coldness in those words hit Ronan like a physical blow. He'd heard similar language from social workers, school administrators, and landlords. Throughout his life, the polite, bureaucratic way of telling someone that their problems were inconvenient and their solutions were someone else's responsibility. Oliver stood up slowly, his face pale. "She's not here to help," he whispered. "She's here to make people leave." Through the door, they could hear Mrs. Chun's voice becoming smaller, more defeated. "This is my home. I've lived here for 8 years. My husband died in this apartment. I can't just I understand this is emotional. The woman's voice interrupted, though it carried no warmth that suggested actual understanding. But business decisions require practical thinking. You have 30 days to decide whether you'd like to accept our buyout offer or sign the new lease at the adjusted rate. Ronan felt his hands clench into fists. The casual cruelty of it, the way this stranger was dismantling Mrs. Chun's life with the same efficiency someone might use to delete files from a computer, triggered every protective instinct he'd developed during his years in the system. He'd seen too many people in positions of power treat vulnerable people as obstacles to be moved, rather than human beings deserving of consideration. We should do something, Oliver said quietly. Like what? Ronan asked, though he was thinking the same thing. I don't know. But she's going to make everyone leave. Not just Mrs. Chun. Everyone. The voices in the hallway were moving now, footsteps clicking against the worn linoleum as the conversation shifted toward the stairwell. Ronan made a quick decision and opened his door just enough to peer into the corridor. The woman from yesterday stood near the stairs, even more imposing up close than she had been from 4 stories above. Her suit was perfectly tailored, her makeup flawless despite the early hour, and she held a leather portfolio that probably cost more than Ronan made in a month. But it was her expression that struck him, the cool, analytical gaze of someone evaluating assets rather than considering lives. Mrs. Chun stood a few feet away, clutching a tissue and looking every one of her 73 years. Her shoulders were hunched with defeat, and she was nodding with the resigned acceptance of someone who had learned not to expect mercy from people with power. Remember, the woman said, her voice carrying easily down the hallway, 30 days. The offer won't remain on the table indefinitely. As she turned toward the stairs, her eyes briefly met Ronan's through the crack in his door. For just a moment, he saw something flicker across her face, a quick assessment, cataloging him as another potential obstacle or opportunity. Then she was gone, her heels echoing down the stairwell like a countdown timer. Ronan waited until he heard the building's front door close before stepping into the hallway. Mrs. Chun was still standing there, looking lost and smaller than he'd ever seen her. Mrs. Chun, are you okay? She looked up at him with tears in her eyes. Oh, Ronan, I'm sorry you had to hear that. I don't know what I'm going to do. Oliver appeared beside Ronan, carrying his backpack and wearing the determined expression he got when he'd made up his mind about something important. She's going to come back, Oliver said quietly. And she's going to ask you to leave too. Ronan looked down at the boy, then back at Mrs. Chun. What exactly did she offer you? $3,000 to break my lease and move out within 30 days, or I can stay and pay $800 more per month. Mrs. Chun wiped her eyes. Either way, I lose my home. Oliver tugged on Ronan's sleeve. We need to find out who she really is. What do you mean? She knew too much about Mrs. Chun's lease. She knew exactly how much to offer. She's not just some developer looking at buying the building. Oliver's voice carried the certainty of someone who had learned to trust his instincts about people's hidden motivations. She already owns it. The possibility hit Ronan like cold water. If Oliver was right, if this woman was already their landlord, then every tenant in the building was living on borrowed time. And more importantly, they were all being lied to about. Who was making the decisions that would determine their futures? Mrs. Chun, Ronan said gently. Did she tell you her name? The elderly woman nodded. Aurelia Croft. She said she was from the building management company. Oliver looked up at Ronan with wide eyes. Croft Holdings, he whispered. That's the company name on our rent checks. As the implications settled over them, Ronan felt that familiar tightness in his chest, the panic of realizing that the ground beneath your feet was less solid than you'd believed. But this time, it wasn't just his own stability at stake. It was Oliver's, Mrs. Chun's, and every other tenant who called this building home. She's not from the management company, Ronan said slowly. She is the management company. By 5 o'clock. That evening, word had spread through Brookstone Apartments like smoke through ventilation ducts. Mrs. Rodriguez had been visited. The young couple in 1A had received their options. Even Mr. Hassan, the building's unofficial handyman who fixed everyone's leaky faucets and loose doorknobs in exchange for homemade meals, had been informed that his services would no longer be needed after the transition period. Ronan sat in his apartment, staring at the notice that had been slipped under his door while he was at his maintenance job. Unlike the others, his was more direct, less diplomatic. Mr. Sheffield, your current lease arrangement does not meet our updated building standards. Please contact our office within 48 hours to discuss immediate relocation assistance. Croft Holdings Management Oliver read it over his shoulder, his small finger tracing the words. She's saving us for last because she thinks we'll be the hardest to move. Why would she think that? Because you're the one everyone comes to when their heat doesn't work or when they're scared about those notices. She's been watching. Oliver looked up at him with that unsettling perception that made Ronan sometimes forget he was talking to someone barely 11 years old. She knows you're the one who helps people feel safe here. The observation was uncomfortably accurate. Over the past 3 years, Ronan had somehow become the building's unofficial problem solver, the person tenants called when their apartments felt unsafe, when they needed someone to check strange noises, or when they simply needed reassurance that they weren't facing their problems alone. It wasn't a role he'd sought, but it had emerged naturally from his combination of security training, natural protective instincts, and Oliver's uncanny ability to sense when people needed help. Maybe we should just take whatever offer she gives. U.S., Ronan said, though the words felt wrong even as he spoke them. Find somewhere else to live. Oliver shook his head firmly. She's counting on everyone thinking that way. That's how she gets people to leave without fighting. Fighting what? She owns the building. She can do whatever she wants. Can she? Oliver asked. Mrs. Chun has been here 8 years. You've been here 3. There are rules about how landlords can treat tenants, aren't there? Ronan had to admit he didn't know. His experience with tenant rights was limited to signing leases and paying rent on time. But Oliver's question sparked something, a stubborn refusal to simply accept that powerful people could uproot lives without consequence. Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion outside. Voices, car doors, and what sounded like someone shouting. Ronan moved to the window and looked down at the street below. Aurelia Croft was standing beside her black sedan, but something was wrong. She was gesturing angrily at her phone, and even from 4 stories up, Ronan could see the tension in her posture. A small crowd of tenants had gathered on the sidewalk. Mrs. Chun, the Rodriguez family, Mr. Hassan, and several others. They weren't protesting or demonstrating. They looked more like people who had simply found themselves in the same place at the same time, united by shared uncertainty. She's angry about something, Oliver observed, joining him at the window as if summoned. By their attention, Aurelia's phone conversation ended abruptly. She dropped the device into her purse with sharp, frustrated movements, then looked up at the building facade with an expression that had moved beyond cool assessment into something closer to barely controlled fury. That's when it happened. Aurelia stepped into the street without looking, her attention focused on the building and her mind clearly elsewhere. The delivery truck came around the corner fast, its driver probably running late and not expecting pedestrians to appear. Suddenly between parked cars, time compressed into a series of disconnected images. The truck's horn blaring, Aurelia's face turning toward the sound with sudden awareness, her expensive heels skidding on wet asphalt as she tried to change direction. The sickening thud of impact, and then silence. Oliver was already moving before Ronan's mind fully processed what had happened. The boy was out their apartment door and running down the stairs with a speed and purpose that suggested he'd been expecting something exactly like this to occur. Ronan followed, his security training kicking in as he took the stairs 3 at a time. By the time he reached the street, Oliver was already kneeling beside Aurelia's motionless form, his small hands checking for signs of life with a competence that was both impressive and disturbing. "She's breathing," Oliver called out as Ronan dropped to his knees beside them. "But her leg is bent wrong and there's blood on her head." The truck driver had stopped and was climbing out of his cab, his face pale with shock. The crowd of tenants stood in a rough circle around them, but at a distance that suggested they weren't sure whether they should help the woman who had been threatening their homes just hours earlier. "Someone call 911, Ronan shouted, then realized he should probably do it himself. He pulled out his phone with hands that were steadier than he felt and dialed. 911, what's your emergency? There's been a pedestrian accident at Brookstone Apartments on 5th Street. A woman was hit by a truck. She's unconscious, possible head injury, definitely broken leg." As he provided details to the dispatcher, Ronan found himself studying Aurelia's face. Unconscious, with her perfect composure stripped away by trauma, she looked younger, more vulnerable. The sharp edges of her professional persona had been replaced by the simple human reality of someone who was hurt and needed help. "Is she going to be okay?" Mrs. Chun asked, approaching hesitantly. Oliver looked up from where he was gently checking Aurelia's pulse. "I think so. But she's really hurt." The irony of the situation wasn't lost on anyone present. The woman who had spent the day telling them they needed to leave their homes was now lying on the sidewalk outside those same homes, dependent on their compassion and assistance. "Should we ... Mrs. Rodriguez started, then stopped, clearly struggling with the ethics of helping someone who had been threatening her family's stability. "Yes," Ronan said firmly, answering the question she hadn't finished asking. "We should help her. Because that's who we are." He meant it. Despite everything, the threats, the ultimatums, the casual cruelty, Aurelia was a human being who was hurt and vulnerable. The fact that she had power over their lives didn't change their responsibility to act with basic human decency. As they waited for the ambulance, Oliver did something that surprised everyone, including Ronan. He took off his jacket, a thin windbreaker. That was probably his warmest piece of clothing, and carefully placed it over Aurelia's unconscious form. "She's cold," he explained simply. The gesture seemed to break something in the tension that had surrounded their interactions with their landlord. Whatever else Aurelia Croft might be, right now she was just someone who needed help. And despite everything she had put them through, the residents of Brookstone Apartments were going to make sure she got it. The emergency room waiting area at Millbrook General Hospital smelled of disinfectant and anxiety. Ronan sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair, his clothes still damp from the evening drizzle, while Oliver dozed fitfully against his shoulder. They had ridden in the ambulance with Aurelia, not because they were family, but because Oliver had refused to leave her side, and the paramedics had been too focused on stabilizing her condition to argue with a determined 11-year-old. "Sheffield?" A nurse approached, consulting a clipboard with the weary efficiency of someone deep into a long shift. "You came in with the accident victim?" Ronan nodded. "How is she?" "Stable. Concussion, broken tibia, some lacerations, but nothing life-threatening. She's conscious now, asking for her phone and something about property documents." The nurse's expression suggested she'd dealt with patients whose first concern upon regaining consciousness was their business affairs. "She's also asking about the people who helped her." Oliver stirred awake, immediately alert in the way that suggested he'd been listening even while appearing to sleep. "Can we see her?" The nurse hesitated. "Are you family?" "We're her tenants," Ronan said, then realized how strange that sounded. "It's complicated." "Everything's complicated in the A," the nurse replied with a tired smile. "Room 237. But keep it brief, she needs rest." They found Aurelia propped up in a hospital bed, her perfect composure replaced by the disheveled reality of someone who had just survived a serious accident. Her dark hair was loose around her shoulders, partially covering a bandage on her temple. Her left leg was elevated and wrapped, and the confident power that had radiated from her that morning had been replaced by the pale fragility of someone confronting their own mortality. She looked up as they entered, and Ronan saw something flicker across her face: surprise, recognition, and something that might have been embarrassment. "You're the man from 4C, she said, her voice hoarse but still carrying traces of its earlier authority. "Ronan Sheffield, this is Oliver." Oliver stepped forward slightly, his natural shyness competing with his need to check on someone he'd helped. "How are you feeling?" Aurelia studied the boy with an expression that was difficult to read. "Better than I should be, thanks to you. The paramedic said you knew enough first aid to potentially save my life." Oliver shrugged. "My grandmother taught me. She said you never know when someone might need help. Your grandmother was wise." Aurelia's gaze shifted between them. "I imagine you both have questions." Ronan pulled up the single visitor chair, gesturing for Oliver to sit while he remained standing. "A few. You want to know why I was really at the building today?" "It wasn't a question. We know you own it," Oliver said quietly. "We figured that out." Aurelia's eyebrows rose slightly. "Perceptive." She paused, seeming to weigh her words. "Yes, I own Brookstone Apartments through Croft Holdings. I also own 17 other properties in this neighborhood." "And you're evicting everyone," Ronan said, not bothering to hide the accusation in his voice. "I'm modernizing underperforming assets." The corporate language came automatically then. She caught herself. I'm reassessing my approach." Oliver leaned forward. "Because of the accident?" "The accident?" "Because of what happened after the accident." Aurelia's voice grew quieter. "I spent the day telling people they needed to leave their homes. Then I ended up unconscious on the street, and those same people I'd just threatened stopped to help me. They called 911, stayed with me, made sure I wasn't alone." She looked directly at Oliver. "You gave me your jacket." Oliver nodded. "You were shivering. It was probably your only warm jacket. I have another one at home." Oliver's matter-of-fact response seemed to affect Aurelia more than any dramatic gesture might have. Ronan watched the exchange with growing understanding. "You don't usually see the people you evict as actual people, do you?" The directness of the question seemed to surprise her. "That's blunt, but accurate." Aurelia was quiet for a long moment. "I've spent the last 5 years building a real estate portfolio by identifying undervalued properties and maximizing their potential. It's been very successful." "That's not an answer." "No," she said finally. "I don't usually see them as people. I see them as variables in an equation: income levels, payment histories, obstacles to optimal property utilization." Oliver tilted his head. "But we are people." "Yes." The word came out softer than her usual confident pronouncements. "You are." A long silence settled over the room, broken only by the distant sounds of hospital activity in the corridor. Ronan found himself studying Aurelia's face, looking for signs of manipulation or calculated sympathy. But what he saw instead was something that looked like genuine confusion, as if she was encountering a problem that couldn't be solved with spreadsheets and bottom-line thinking. "What happens now?" Ronan asked. "I don't know." The admission seemed to surprise her as much as it did them. "I've never been in a situation where my business decisions became ... personal." "They were always personal," Oliver said quietly. "You just weren't there to see it." Aurelia looked at the boy with something approaching wonder. "How old are you?" 11. "You're 11 years old, and you understand something that took me 28 years to miss." She leaned back against her pillows, wincing slightly. "The doctor says I'll be here for at least 2 days. My assistant is handling my appointments. My lawyer is managing the property transitions, and I'm lying here thinking about a boy who gave his jacket to someone who was trying to take away his home. So you'll stop the evictions? Ronan asked. I don't know, she repeated. I need to think about what this all means. What I want it to mean. Oliver stood up and moved to the side of her bed. Can I ask you something? Of course. Do you like making people scared? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Aurelia stared at Oliver for a long moment, and Ronan could see her working through the implications of the question, not just what Oliver was asking, but what her honest answer would reveal about herself. No, she said finally. I don't like it, but I've gotten very good at not thinking about it. Oliver nodded as if this confirmed something he'd already suspected. My grandmother used to say that the hardest thing about growing up is learning the difference between being strong and being mean. Aurelia's eyes filled with tears so suddenly that Ronan wondered if her head injury was affecting her emotional control. But then she spoke, and her voice was steady. Your grandmother sounds like she was a remarkable woman. She was, Oliver agreed. She also used to say that it's never too late to choose who you want to be. As they prepared to leave, Aurelia called out to them. Ronan? Oliver? Thank you. Not just for helping me today, but for showing me something I needed to see. Walking back through the hospital corridors, Oliver slipped his hand into Ronan's. She's going to change her mind about the evictions. How can you be sure? Because she's not mean. She's just been scared for so long that she forgot how to be anything else. 3 days later, Ronan was replacing a broken window latch in apartment 3B when he heard the commotion outside. Oliver, who had been reading quietly in the corner while Ronan worked, suddenly looked up with the alert expression he wore when his invisible radar detected something significant. She's back, Oliver said. Simply, Ronan moved to the window and looked down at the street. Aurelia's black sedan was parked in front of the building. But instead of the confident figure who had emerged from it earlier that week, a woman on crutches was slowly making her way toward the entrance. She moved carefully, clearly still recovering from her injuries, and she was dressed differently: jeans instead of a business suit, a simple sweater instead of corporate armor. Should we go down? Oliver asked. Ronan considered this. Part of him was curious about what Aurelia's return meant for all of them. Another part wanted to avoid whatever conversation was coming, sensing that it might complicate the simple narrative of landlord versus tenant that had defined their relationship so far. Yeah, he decided. Let's go see what she wants. They found Aurelia in the building's small lobby, studying the wall of mailboxes with an expression that suggested she was seeing them for the first time. She looked up as they approached, and Ronan noticed that without her makeup and professional styling, she appeared younger, maybe early 30s instead of the ageless authority figure she'd seen before. Ronan, Oliver. She balanced awkwardly on her crutches and extended an envelope. I wanted to give you this personally. Oliver looked at the envelope suspiciously. Is it another notice telling us to move? No. Aurelia's voice carried a gentleness that hadn't been there during their previous encounters. It's an apology. Ronan opened the envelope and found a handwritten letter, not typed corporate correspondence, but actual handwriting on personal stationery. The change felt significant, as if she'd moved from making announcements to attempting actual communication. Dear Ronan and Oliver, I've spent the last 3 days thinking about what happened, not just the accident, but everything that led up to it. I realized that I came to your building with a plan to displace people from their homes, and I never once considered what that would actually mean for the people involved. I want you to know that all eviction proceedings have been suspended indefinitely. No one will be forced to leave their home because of decisions I made without understanding their impact. More than that, I want to apologize for treating you and your neighbors as obstacles instead of human beings. Oliver, your kindness taught me something important about the difference between being successful and being decent. Ronan, Your willingness to help someone who had threatened. Your security showed me what real strength looks like. I would like to make amends. If you'll let me. Aurelia Ronan read the letter twice, then handed it to Oliver, who read it with the careful attention he gave to anything important. What does make amends mean exactly? Ronan asked. Aurelia shifted on her crutches, clearly uncomfortable, but determined to continue. It means I want to fix the things I broke, starting with this building. The building's not broken, Oliver said. It just needs someone to take care of it. You're right. And I want to be that someone, not as an investor looking for maximum returns, but as someone who understands that this is people's home. She paused. I was hoping you might help me understand what that actually means. Ronan studied her face, looking for signs of manipulation or calculated charm. But what he saw instead was uncertainty, vulnerability, and something that might have. Then Hope, why should we trust you? He asked. Because I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to teach me how to earn it. Oliver stepped forward. What kind of help do you want? I want to know what this building needs to be a good home. For people. Not what I think it needs, but what the people who live here think it needs. Aurelia looked around the lobby with its worn carpet and flickering overhead light. I want to understand the difference between improving a property and improving people's lives. Those aren't the same thing? Oliver asked. I'm beginning to realize they're not. Aurelia's admission carried the weight of someone questioning fundamental assumptions about how the world worked. I've been thinking about what you said, about choosing who you want to be. I want to be someone who builds homes, not someone who destroys them. Ronan found himself faced with a decision he hadn't expected to make. The safe choice would be to accept the suspension of evictions and maintain a cautious distance from someone who had recently threatened their stability. But Oliver's earlier insight about Aurelia, being scared rather than mean, resonated with his own experience of how people could become defensive versions of themselves when they felt unsafe. Mrs. Chun's apartment has a leak in the ceiling, he said finally. It's been getting worse for months, and the previous management company kept saying they'd fix it eventually. Aurelia nodded. What else? The heating system doesn't work properly on the first 2 floors. People have been using space heaters, which is dangerous and expensive. The elevator breaks down at least once a month. The security door hasn't locked properly in over a year. I can fix all of that. Aurelia's response was immediate and confident. What else? Oliver looked up at her thoughtfully. It's not just about fixing things that are broken. It's about making this feel like a place where people want to stay. What would that look like? Well, Oliver said, warming to the subject, the lobby could have chairs where people could sit and talk to each other. And maybe plants. Mrs. Rodriguez grows amazing flowers, but she only has room for them in her apartment. And the roof has space for a garden where people could grow vegetables if they wanted to. Aurelia listened with the focused attention of someone taking notes for an important exam. Those are good ideas. What else? As they talked, Ronan found himself beginning to believe that Aurelia's transformation might be genuine. Not because she was saying the right things, but because she was asking the right questions. Questions that suggested she wanted to understand rather than simply manage. There's something else, Oliver said quietly. The reason people were scared when you came to talk to them wasn't just because you might make them move. It's because nobody ever asks what they need or want. They're used to people making decisions about their lives without including them. Aurelia was quiet for a long moment. So how do I include them? You ask, Oliver said simply. And then you listen to the answers. As if summoned by their conversation, Mrs. Chun appeared in the lobby, returning from what was probably her second job of the day. She stopped when she saw Aurelia, her expression cautious but no longer fearful. Mrs. Chun, Aurelia said, balancing on her crutches to face the older woman. I owe you an apology. And I was hoping you might help me understand how to make this building a better home for you and everyone else who lives here." Mrs. Chun looked at Ronan and Oliver, as if checking whether this was some kind of trick. Oliver nodded encouragingly. "You really want to know?" Mrs. Chun asked. "I really want to know." And as Mrs. Chun began to describe the challenges of living in a building where maintenance requests went unanswered and rent increases came without warning, Ronan realized that something fundamental had shifted. For the first time since he'd become Oliver's guardian, he was witnessing someone with power choosing to use it, to listen rather than control. It felt like the beginning of something entirely new. 2 weeks later, Brookstone Apartments had transformed into something resembling a construction zone, but with an atmosphere of anticipation rather than disruption. Aurelia had hired a crew of local contractors, not a faceless corporate renovation company, but craftsmen from the neighborhood who understood the difference between renovation and gentrification. The work proceeded methodically: new boiler system, electrical upgrades, roof repairs, and a dozen smaller improvements that collectively changed how the building felt to its residents. Ronan found himself in an unexpected role as unofficial liaison between Aurelia and the tenants. His security background made him useful for assessing safety issues, while his relationships with the residents meant people trusted him to represent their interests honestly. More surprisingly, Aurelia seemed to genuinely value his input, asking his opinion on everything from hallway lighting to the type of locks that would make people feel secure without making the building feel like a fortress. "The new heating system should be online by tomorrow," Aurelia said, consulting her tablet as she stood in the building's basement. Her business attire had been permanently replaced by practical clothes, jeans, comfortable shoes, and sweaters that could withstand dusty construction environments. The crutches were gone, though she still favored her previously injured leg when walking on uneven surfaces. Ronan nodded, checking the freshly installed ductwork that would finally bring consistent heat to apartments that had relied on inadequate space heaters for years. "Mrs. Rodriguez is going to cry when her apartment actually stays warm. Good tears, I hope." "Definitely good tears." Oliver appeared at the bottom of the basement stairs, carrying a thermos of coffee and wearing the serious expression he adopted when managing important responsibilities. Over the past 2 weeks, he had appointed himself as the building's unofficial coordinator, keeping track of which apartments needed attention and ensuring that elderly residents like Mrs. Chun weren't overwhelmed by the construction activity. "Elevator repair people are here," he announced, "and Mrs. Chun wants to know if she can show you her ideas for the lobby." Aurelia smiled, an expression that had become more frequent and more genuine over recent days. "Tell her I'll be up in 10 minutes. I want to see what she's been working on." As Oliver headed back upstairs, Aurelia turned to Ronan. "He's remarkable, you know. The way he keeps track of everyone's needs, remembers what people have told him. Make sure no one feels left out. Those are skills most adults never develop." Ronan felt the familiar surge of pride, mixed with protective concern, that came whenever someone recognized Oliver's unique qualities. He's always been like that. Sometimes I think he sees connections between things that other people miss. Where did he learn to be so emotionally intelligent? The question touched on territory that Ronan rarely discussed with anyone, but something about Aurelia's genuine curiosity and the work they'd been doing together had built a foundation of trust he hadn't expected. "His grandmother," Ronan said finally. "She raised him from the time he was small. She had this way of paying attention to people, really paying attention, not just waiting for her turn to talk. Oliver learned that from her." "What happened to her?" "Heart attack 3 years ago. Sudden. Oliver was 8. Ronan paused, remembering those early days of trying to figure out how to be responsible for someone else's entire world. "I was just their neighbor, but she'd made me Oliver's emergency contact. Social services wanted to place him in foster care, but I'd been in the system myself. I knew what that was like." Aurelia was quiet for a moment, processing this information. So you became his guardian. I became his family. The distinction felt important. It wasn't about paperwork or legal obligations. It was about making sure he had someone who would always show up. Like you did for me, Aurelia said quietly. Ronan looked at her, surprised by the connection she'd drawn. That was different. You were hurt. Anyone would have helped. Would they? Aurelia's question carried the weight of someone who had recently discovered that her assumptions about human nature might be incomplete. I spent that day threatening people's homes, and they still called 911 when I needed help. You still stayed with me at the hospital. Oliver still gave me his jacket. Because that's what decent people do. But not what I would have done. The admission came quietly, almost reluctantly. Before all this, if I'd seen someone hurt on the street, I would have called 911 and kept walking. I would have told myself that staying would complicate things, that emergency responders were better qualified to help, that I had important appointments I couldn't miss. Ronan studied her face, seeing something that looked like shame mixed with determination. But you wouldn't do that now. No, I wouldn't. Aurelia picked up a piece of the old heating equipment that had been removed from the system, a corroded pipe that had been forcing residents to choose between warmth and financial stability. I keep thinking about all the decisions I made before I understood what they actually meant. Not just about this building, but about all my properties. How many families did I displace? How many Mrs. Chuns did I force to choose between their homes and their financial security? The weight of those questions seemed to settle around her like a heavy coat. Ronan recognized the expression, the moment when someone realizes that their past actions have consequences they never considered. You can't change what you did before, he said gently, but you can change what you do now. Is that enough? It's a start. They worked in comfortable silence for a while, Aurelia taking notes on her tablet while Ronan finished his inspection of the new heating system. The basement had been transformed from a neglected space full of broken equipment into something that actually supported the building's function, much like Aurelia herself had been transformed from a threatening presence into someone working to build rather than extract. Ronan? Aurelia's voice carried a hesitancy that suggested she was about to ask something important. Would you and Oliver like to have dinner with me tonight? Not here in the building, but at my apartment. I'd like you to see where I live. The invitation surprised him. Why? Because I've been learning about your home, and I think it might help you understand me better if you saw mine. That evening, they drove to Aurelia's apartment in the upscale Meridian district, a stark contrast to the working class neighborhood where Brookstone Apartments stood. Her building was everything that Brookstone wasn't. Sleek glass facade, doorman, elevator that never broke down, and an address that announced prosperity to anyone who knew the city's geography. But her actual apartment surprised both Ronan and Oliver. Instead of the cold minimalism they'd expected, the space felt almost sparse, expensive furniture arranged with catalog precision. But no personal touches, no evidence of hobbies or relationships or life lived outside of work. It's very clean, Oliver observed, which was his diplomatic way of noting that the apartment felt more like a hotel suite than a home. Aurelia laughed, but without much humor. You can say it feels empty. That's what I realized when I started spending time at Brookstone. I've been living in a beautiful space that doesn't actually feel like a home. As she prepared dinner, a simple meal that she clearly didn't cook often, Aurelia talked about her life with a candor that surprised Ronan. She'd grown up wealthy but emotionally neglected, learned early that achievement was the primary currency of love, and had spent her adult life building a business empire that provided financial security but no real connection to other people. I was good at making money, she said as they sat around her dining table, which probably hadn't hosted a meal in months. But I was terrible at making a life. Oliver looked around the apartment thoughtfully. You could bring some of Mrs. Rodriguez's flowers here. And maybe some books. You can't really know someone's home if you don't know what they like to read. What else? Aurelia asked, genuinely interested in his assessment. Pictures of people you care about. And maybe things that aren't perfect, like the coffee mug I painted for Ronan that's lopsided, but he still uses it every morning. Ronan smiled, remembering the mug in question. It's my favorite mug. Because I made it for you, Oliver said matter-factly.aure was quiet for a moment, processing the implication of Oliver's observation. I don't have pictures of people I care about, because I haven't let myself care about people. I don't have imperfect things because I've been afraid that imperfection would make me vulnerable. Being vulnerable isn't the same as being weak, Oliver said. Ronan taught me that. As the evening continued, Ronan found himself seeing Aurelia, not as the intimidating landlord who had threatened their security, but as someone who had built walls so high that she'd forgotten how to build bridges. The transformation wasn't complete. He could still see traces of the controlling precision that had made her successful in business, but there was also something new emerging. Something that looked like a person learning how to be human rather than just efficient. When they prepared to leave, Aurelia walked them to the door with an expression that mixed gratitude and uncertainty. Thank you, she said, for helping me see the difference between having a place to live and having a home. Thank you for trying to learn the difference, Ronan replied. As they rode the elevator down to the parking garage, Oliver looked up at Ronan thoughtfully. She's going to be okay, isn't she? What makes you think that? Because she's not trying to be perfect anymore. She's trying to be real. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a courier service that Aurelia recognized from her previous business dealings. Heavy paper, corporate letterhead, and the kind of legal language that she'd once wielded like a weapon, but now read with growing unease. Ms. Croft, we represent Meridian Development Corporation in regards to your recent deviation from established property management protocols. Your decision to suspend profit optimization procedures at the Brookstone Avenue property constitutes a breach of your consulting agreement with our organization. We require immediate cessation of renovation activities and resumption of tenant displacement procedures per the original timeline. Failure to comply will result in legal action to recover financial losses associated with your unauthorized decisions. You have 48 hours to respond. Aurelia sat in her office, a sterile space in a gleaming downtown building that felt increasingly alien to her, staring at the letter that represented everything she was trying to move away from. Meridian Development was the corporate entity that had funded her property acquisitions, providing the capital that allowed her to build her real estate portfolio in exchange for aggressive profit margins and rapid tenant turnover. 6 months ago, she would have immediately called Brookstone's residents and informed them that the brief reprieve was over. She would have calculated the financial cost of sentimentality and made the practical decision to protect her business relationships. But 6 months ago, she hadn't known that Mrs. Chun worked 60 hours a week just to afford rent, or that Oliver painted stones with encouraging words, or that Ronan had chosen to become a family with someone who needed one. Her phone buzzed with a text from Oliver. Mrs. Rodriguez wants to show you her idea for the roof garden this afternoon. She drew diagrams, the contrast between the corporate ultimatum on her desk and the innocent enthusiasm in Oliver's message crystallized everything she'd been struggling with over the past month. She was being forced to choose not just between business strategies, but between the person she'd been and the person she was becoming. That afternoon, instead of calling Meridian Development, Aurelia found herself on the roof of Brookstone Apartments with Mrs. Rodriguez, Oliver, and Ronan, listening to an animated explanation of how the flat rooftop could be transformed into a community garden. Mrs. Rodriguez had indeed drawn diagrams, detailed sketches showing raised beds, a composting area, and space for residents to grow vegetables, herbs, and flowers. My grandmother had a garden like this in Mexico, Mrs. Rodriguez explained, her usual shyness overcome by enthusiasm for the project. She grew tomatoes and peppers and herbs for the whole neighborhood. People would come to sit and talk while they worked with the plants. Oliver was studying the diagrams with the serious attention he gave to any project he deemed important. We could have a section for flowers that people could cut and take inside. And maybe benches where people could sit and read. What do you think? Aurelia asked Ronan. I think it's exactly the kind of thing that makes a building feel like a community instead of just a place where people sleep. Aurelia looked out over the roof, trying to envision Mrs. Rodriguez's garden, but her mind kept returning to the letter in her office. The financial realities that the letter represented weren't abstract. They were contracts and loans and business. Relationships that couldn't simply be wished away. There's something I need to tell you all, she said finally. The renovations, the improvements we've been making, they're not just coming from my personal funds. I have business partners who expect certain returns on their investments. Ronan's expression grew cautious. What kind of returns? The kind that require raising rents and replacing existing tenants with people who can pay higher rates. Aurelia's voice carried the heaviness of someone confessing to a crime they were still committing. What we've been doing here, treating this as a community to improve rather than an asset to optimize. My partners consider that a breach of our agreements. The silence that followed was different from the comfortable quiet they'd shared while working together. This was the silence of people processing betrayal, of realizing that the stability they'd begun to trust might be temporary after all. So, you have to choose, Oliver said quietly, between them and us. The stark simplicity of his observation cut through all the financial complexity and legal obligations. In the end, it really was that simple. Yes, Aurelia admitted. I have to choose. What happens if you choose them? Mrs. Rodriguez asked. You get displaced. The building gets renovated for people who can afford to pay twice what you're paying now. I maintain my business relationships and continue building wealth. And if you choose us, I face legal action, potential financial ruin, and the end of my real estate business as I've built it. Aurelia paused. But you get to stay home. Oliver looked up at her with that disconcerting directness that made her feel like he could see through to her motivations. What do you want to choose? The question should have been easy to answer. 6 months ago, it would have been easy. But now, standing on the roof of a building where she'd learned the difference between managing property and caring for people, Aurelia found that her priorities had shifted in ways that surprised her. I want to choose you, she said. But I'm scared. Of losing money? Ronan asked. Of losing everything I've built, of starting over. Of not knowing who I am if I'm not the person who always makes the smart business decision. Oliver walked over to the edge of the roof and looked down at the street where he'd first seen Aurelia lying unconscious after the accident. You know what my grandmother used to say about being scared? What? She said that being scared of the right things means you're finally paying attention to what matters. Aurelia joined him at the roof's edge, looking down at the neighborhood. That had become more real to her than the corporate boardrooms where she'd spent most of her adult life. And what do you think matters? This, Oliver said, gesturing toward the building beneath them. People having homes, Mrs. Chun not having. To work 70 hours a week just to have a place to sleep. Mrs. Rodriguez getting to grow her grandmother's tomatoes. Ronan not having to worry about me having to change schools again, even if it means I lose everything else. Oliver considered this seriously. Will you really lose everything? Or will you just lose the things that weren't making you happy anyway? That evening, Aurelia sat in her sparse apartment, staring at 2 documents, the ultimatum from Meridian Development and a contract termination letter her lawyer had prepared. Signing the termination would end her business relationships, trigger lawsuits, and probably force her to sell most of her properties to cover her legal obligations and financial commitments. It would also mean that Mrs. Chun could keep her home, that Oliver wouldn't have to change schools, that Ronan wouldn't have to uproot the life he'd built for both of them. She thought about Oliver's question. Would she really lose everything, or just the things that weren't making her happy? Her wealth had provided security, but not satisfaction. Her business success had earned respect, but not relationships. Her perfectly controlled life had been efficient, but empty. At midnight, she signed the termination letter and emailed it to her lawyer with instructions to notify Meridian Development immediately. Then she called Ronan. "It's late," he said when he answered, but without irritation, just concern. "I wanted you to know," she said. "I chose you. I chose all of you." There was a pause, and she could hear Oliver's voice in the background, asking what was happening. "What does that mean, exactly?" Ronan asked. "It means I'm ending my business partnerships. It means no one gets evicted. It means Brookstone Apartments gets to be a home instead of an investment opportunity. And what does it mean for you?" Aurelia looked around her empty apartment and realized that for the first time in years, she wasn't sure what came next. But instead of feeling terrifying, the uncertainty felt like possibility. "It means I get to find out who I am when I'm not trying to be the smartest person in the room," she said. "It means I get to learn how to build something that matters instead of just something that's profitable." After she hung up, Aurelia sat in the dark for a long time, thinking about Oliver's painted stones and Mrs. Rodriguez's garden diagrams, and the coffee mug that Ronan treasured because someone who loved him had made it imperfectly. For the first time in her adult life, she had no 5-year plan, no profit projections, no strategic objectives. But she had something she'd never had before, a reason to build something that would outlast her bank account. The Millbrook Heights Community Development meeting was typically attended by a dozen people on a busy night, mostly local business owners, a few longtime residents, and the occasional activist with more passion than practical experience. The meetings were held in the basement of St. Matthew's Church, in a room that smelled of coffee and old hymnals, where folding chairs were arranged in optimistic rows that rarely filled. Tonight was different. Word had spread through the neighborhood that Aurelia Croft would be addressing the community about her plans for local properties, and the basement was packed with nearly 60 people. Tenants from multiple buildings, local shop owners, residents who had been fighting gentrification for years, and several people in expensive suits who clearly represented competing development interests. Ronan and Oliver sat in the third row, both wearing the slightly formal clothes they reserved for parent-teacher conferences and other occasions that required looking responsible. Oliver clutched a folder containing something he'd been working on for the past week, project he'd refused to discuss beyond saying it was important for the meeting. Aurelia stood at the front of the room, looking unlike any version of herself that Ronan had seen before. She wasn't wearing the corporate armor of her business days or the casual work clothes she'd adopted during the building renovations. Instead, she'd chosen something that managed to be both professional and approachable clothing that announced she was serious without suggesting she was untouchable. "Most of you know me as the person who owns buildings in neighborhood," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the small space. "Some of you know me as the person who is planning to raise your rents and force you to move. And some of you know me as someone who's been trying to learn the difference between managing properties and caring for communities." A murmur ran through the crowd, some supportive, some skeptical, all attentive. 6 weeks ago, I stood in the basement of Brookstone Apartments and told an elderly woman that she needed to choose between paying $800 more per month in rent or accepting $3,000 to leave her home. I thought I was making a business decision. I thought I was optimizing an underperforming asset. Ronan watched faces in the crowd as Aurelia spoke. Mrs. Chun sat near the front, her expression unreadable. Several other residents from Brookstone and neighboring buildings leaned forward, listening intently. The people in expensive suits were taking notes. What I didn't understand, Aurelia continued, was that I wasn't managing property. I was destroying community. I was treating people's homes as obstacles to profit, rather than recognizing that those homes were the foundation of something much more valuable than any financial return I could generate. A man in the back row raised his hand. So what's your point? You feel bad about being a landlord? You want us to forgive you? Aurelia shook her head. I want to do better. More than that, I want to prove that it's possible to improve neighborhoods without displacing the people who make them worth improving. She gestured toward an easel where she'd hung a large poster board covered with charts and photographs. Over the past month, I've been working with residents of Brookstone Apartments to renovate and improve their building. Not to justify higher rents, but to make their homes more comfortable, safer, and more connected to each other. The photographs showed before and after images of the building's improvements, the new heating system, the repaired elevator, the lobby that Mrs. Chun had helped design with comfortable seating, and space for Mrs. Rodriguez's plants. The financial model I'm proposing is simple, Aurelia said. Rent increases that match inflation rather than market speculation. Maintenance and improvements funded by stable long-term income rather than rapid tenant turnover. And most importantly, decisions made in partnership with residents rather than imposed on them. A woman near the front raised her hand. That sounds nice in theory, but how do you make money that way? I make less money, Aurelia replied simply, but I make sustainable money. And I contribute to building community wealth instead of extracting it. The honesty of her answer seemed to surprise people. Several audience members exchanged glances, as if they hadn't expected such directness. The bigger question, Aurelia continued, is whether this community wants to support development that builds on what exists here, or development that replaces what exists here with something more expensive and less connected. That's when Oliver stood up. Ronan looked at him in surprise. Oliver rarely spoke in groups larger than 3 or 4 people, and never in settings this formal. But the boy walked to the front of the room with the quiet determination he showed when something was important enough to overcome his natural shyness. Can I say something? He asked Aurelia. She nodded, stepping aside to give him space. Oliver opened his folder and pulled out a hand-drawn map of the neighborhood, detailed enough to show individual buildings and annotated with careful handwriting. I've been walking around the neighborhood for the past month, he said, his voice quiet but clear enough to reach the back of the room. I wanted to understand what makes this place special before people try to change it. He held up the map so everyone could see it. This is Mr. Hassan, who fixes everyone's broken things even when they can't pay him. This is the corner store where Mrs. Kim knows everyone's names and lets people pay later when money's tight. This is the park where teenagers from 3 different schools play basketball together, even though their schools are supposed to be rivals. As Oliver pointed to different locations on his map, people in the audience began nodding, recognizing the places and people he was describing. And this, he said, pointing to Brookstone Apartments, is where Mrs. Chun makes soup for anyone who's sick, and where Mrs. Rodriguez grows flowers to give to people who look sad, and where Ronan taught me that family isn't just people who are related to you. Oliver looked directly at Aurelia. When you were planning to make people move, you weren't just changing buildings. You were breaking connections between people who take care of each other. He turned back to the audience. But when you started listening to what people actually needed, and when you helped Mrs. Rodriguez plan her rooftop garden and made sure Mrs. Chun's apartment would finally stay warm, you weren't just fixing buildings. You were making it possible for people to take better care of each other. The room was completely quiet now. Everyone focused on the 11-year-old boy, who was articulating something that many of them had felt but hadn't known how to express. I think, Oliver said, that the question isn't whether development is good or bad. The question is whether the people who make decisions about neighborhoods understand that neighborhoods are made of relationships, not just buildings. He folded up his map and looked around the room. And I think that understanding that doesn't happen automatically. It happens when people like Aurelia choose to listen to people like Mrs. Chun, and when people like all of us choose to teach people like Aurelia what community actually means. As Oliver returned to his seat, the silence stretched for several seconds before scattered applause began to build into something more sustained. But more than the applause, Ronan noticed the expressions on people's faces, the recognition of someone who had managed to articulate something true and important in a way that made it impossible to ignore. The meeting continued for another hour, with questions and discussions and debates about zoning laws and financing models. But the energy had shifted after Oliver's intervention. The conversation was no longer about whether Aurelia's approach was realistic, but about how similar approaches might be implemented more broadly. As people began to leave, Mrs. Chun approached Aurelia with an expression that mixed gratitude and determination. "I want to help," she said simply. "Other buildings in the neighborhood, their residents need to know that what you did at Brookstone is possible. I want to help you teach other landlords how to listen." Mrs. Rodriguez nodded agreement. "My sister lives in a building 3 blocks away. Same problems we had: broken heat, rising rents, no one listening. If we could show them what's possible." Aurelia looked around at the small group that had gathered: residents from multiple buildings, business owners, even a few of the activists who had arrived expecting to oppose her plans. "So we start a model," she said. "Not just one building, but a demonstration that development can strengthen communities instead of displacing them." Oliver looked up at Ronan. "Like planting seeds?" "Exactly like planting seeds," Ronan agreed. As they walked home through the neighborhood that Oliver had mapped with such care, Aurelia fell into step beside them. "Thank you," she said to Oliver, "for helping me understand what I was really choosing between." "Thank you for choosing us," Oliver replied. But Ronan realized that the choice had become larger than just one building or one group of tenants. Oliver's presentation had transformed Aurelia's personal redemption into a public model for how development could work differently. The boy who had once whispered warnings about hidden dangers had learned to speak publicly about hidden possibilities. First annual Millbrook Heights Community Festival took place on a warm Saturday in late spring, 6 months after the community development meeting that had launched what local newspapers were calling the Brookstone Model. What had started as a small demonstration project at one apartment building had expanded into a neighborhood-wide effort to prove that development could strengthen rather than displace existing communities. The festival was held in Peterson Park, a small green space that had been cleaned up and expanded through volunteer efforts coordinated between residents and local business owners. Food trucks lined the park's perimeter, but unlike typical food truck gatherings, these represented the neighborhood's existing establishments. Mrs. Kim's Corner Store was serving Korean-Mexican fusion. The Ethiopian restaurant from 2 blocks over was offering family platters, and 3 different residents had organized bake sales featuring family recipes. Ronan stood near the main stage, watching Oliver help Mrs. Rodriguez arrange flowers from her now famous rooftop garden. The garden had become something of a neighborhood attraction, not just for its produce, but as a gathering place where residents from multiple buildings came to work, share meals, and plan community projects. "Hard to believe it's only been 6 months, Aurelia said, appearing beside him with 2 cups of Mrs. Kim's famous iced coffee. Ronan accepted the coffee and looked around at the scene surrounding them. The festival wasn't large by city standards, but it radiated the kind of authentic energy that couldn't be manufactured or marketed. Families from multiple buildings were sharing picnic tables. Teenagers were teaching older residents how to use a community garden app that Oliver had helped design, and at least 3 different groups were engaged and animated, planning discussions for projects that would extend well beyond the day's celebration. "Has it been what you expected?" Ronan asked. Aurelia laughed. "I don't think I had expectations." 6 months ago, I was planning to evict half the neighborhood and maximize rental income. Now I'm co-sponsoring a festival celebrating community connections I didn't know existed. On the stage, a local high school band was setting up equipment, while Oliver consulted with the festival's volunteer coordinators about the afternoon schedule. His role had evolved naturally from neighborhood mapper to community liaison, the person who seemed to know everyone's projects and could help connect people working on complementary efforts. "He's in his element," Aurelia observed. "He's always been good at bringing people together," Ronan agreed. "But I think this is the first time he's been in a community where that skill was really appreciated." The afternoon's programming reflected the collaborative spirit that had developed over the past months. Mrs. Chun gave a presentation about tenant organizing strategies. Mr. Hassan offered a workshop on basic home repair skills. A group of teenagers performed spoken word pieces about neighborhood change and community resilience. But the moment that defined the day came when Oliver was invited to speak about the community mapping project that had evolved from his original hand-drawn neighborhood diagram. He stood at the microphone looking less nervous than Ronan had expected, holding a folder that contained months of work documenting not just buildings and businesses, but the networks of mutual support that connected them. 6 months ago, Oliver began, I drew a map because I wanted to understand what makes this neighborhood special. But maps aren't just about showing where things are. They're about showing how things connect to each other. He gestured toward a large poster board that displayed the evolved version of his original drawing. The current map showed not just physical locations, but relationship networks, which buildings shared resources, which residents had formed childcare cooperatives, which businesses offered services that supported community needs rather than just individual consumption. "What I learned," Oliver continued, "is that community isn't something that just happens. It's something people create by choosing to pay attention to each other and choosing to help when help is needed." He looked out at the audience, which included not just local residents, but representatives from other neighborhoods who had come to learn about replicating similar approaches. "When Aurelia first came to our building, she was thinking about us as individual units that either paid rent or didn't pay rent. But we weren't individual units. We were Mrs. Chun, who makes soup for people when they're sick, and Mrs. Rodriguez, who gives flowers to people who look sad, and Ronan, who teaches people how to be safe and how to be family." Oliver paused, consulting his notes with the careful attention of someone who wanted to get important words exactly right. The difference between development that hurts communities and development that helps communities isn't really about money or buildings. It's about whether the people making decisions understand that communities are made of relationships between people who choose to take care of each other. He held up a newer version of his map, this one showing connections that extended beyond the immediate neighborhood. "And what we've learned over the past 6 months is that when people have stable homes, and when they know they're not going to be forced to move, they can build stronger relationships with each other. When Mrs. Rodriguez doesn't have to worry about rent increases, she can spend time teaching other people how to grow vegetables. When Mrs. Chun knows her home is secure, she can help organize other tenants instead of just trying to survive." The audience was completely focused now, and Ronan could see people taking notes, making connections between Oliver's observations and their own experiences. "So the map keeps growing," Oliver concluded. "Because every time someone chooses to listen instead of just talking, every time someone chooses to help instead of just taking, every time someone chooses to stay and build instead of leaving or destroying, the community gets stronger and the map gets more connected." As Oliver returned to his seat, the applause was sustained and genuine. But more than the recognition, Ronan could see that something had crystallized for many people in the audience, an understanding of how individual actions connected to collective outcomes, how personal choices about listening and helping created the foundation for systemic change. The rest of the afternoon unfolded with the Organic energy of a celebration that people genuinely wanted to be part of. Music, food, conversation, and planning sessions that generated enough ideas for months of future projects. As the sun began to set, Ronan found himself sitting on a park bench with Aurelia and Oliver, watching families pack up picnic supplies and teenagers reluctantly pick up basketball games. "So what happens next?" Aurelia asked. "More of this," Oliver said simply. "More maps, more gardens, more people learning how to listen to each other. More buildings where people get to stay home instead of being forced to move," Ronan added. Aurelia nodded. More proof that development can build community instead of destroying it. As they walked home through streets that had become more familiar and more connected over the past months, Oliver stopped suddenly and pulled his current map out of his backpack. "I want to add something," he said, settling onto the front steps of Brookstone Apartments to make his addition. "What are you adding?" Ronan asked. Oliver smiled as he carefully drew a small symbol near the building where they lived. "A star," he said, "for the place where we learned that home isn't just where you live. It's where people choose to stay and take care of each other. Looking at the building that had transformed from a source of anxiety into a foundation for community, Ronan realized that Oliver was documenting something larger than neighborhood change. He was mapping the evolution of what it meant to belong. Somewhere to choose people and be chosen by them, to build something together that was stronger than what any of them could create alone. 2 years later, the phone call came on a Tuesday morning while Ronan was installing new security lights in the lobby of Brookstone Apartments. The building had become something of a showcase for community-centered development, regularly hosting visitors from other cities who wanted to understand how the model might be replicated elsewhere. "Mr. Sheffield?" The voice on the phone was professionally warm but unfamiliar. "This is Sandra Martinez from the Municipal Housing Authority. We've been following the work you've been doing with community development in Millbrook Heights." Ronan set down his drill and stepped away from the ladder where he'd been working. Over the past 2 years, his role had evolved from building maintenance to something closer to community coordination, helping other property owners implement resident-centered approaches to building management. "What can I do for you?" "We're launching a new initiative to support landlords and property managers who want to adopt community building approaches rather than profit maximization strategies. We'd like to offer you a position as a community development coordinator." The offer represented exactly the kind of opportunity Ronan might have dreamed about 3 years earlier: stable employment, benefits, recognition for work he'd been doing as a volunteer. But it also meant leaving Brookstone Apartments, possibly leaving the neighborhood where he and Oliver had built their life. "Can I think about it?" he asked. "Of course. But I should mention that the position would be based here, in Millbrook Heights. We want coordinators who understand the communities they're working with." After hanging up, Ronan climbed the stairs to the 4th floor, where he found Oliver in the apartment they'd recently expanded into the neighboring unit when it became vacant. The boy, now 13 and showing signs of becoming a teenager, was working on his laptop, updating the neighborhood resource database that had grown from his original hand-drawn maps into a comprehensive digital platform used by residents throughout the area. "Someone wants to hire me," Ronan said, settling into the chair beside Oliver's desk. Oliver looked up with interest. "Doing what?" "Helping other neighborhoods do what we did here. Teaching landlords how to work with tenants instead of against them." "That's good, right?" Oliver's question carried the cautious tone he used when he sensed complications beneath simple announcements. "It's good. But it would mean traveling more, being away from here more often." Oliver considered this seriously. At 13, he'd developed a thoughtful way of processing change that balanced his natural preference for stability with his growing understanding that some changes created opportunities for growth. "Would you still live here?" "Yes, this is home," Oliver nodded. "And would I still be able to help if you wanted to?" They're interested in the mapping work you've been doing." A smile spread across Oliver's face, the quiet satisfaction he showed when his work was recognized as valuable rather than just unusual. "Mrs. Chun always says that the best way to keep what you have is to help other people get the same thing. Is that a yes?" "That's a yes." The decision to accept the position marked the beginning of a new phase in their story, but not an ending. Ronan's work expanded to include neighborhoods throughout the city, helping residents and property owners navigate the complex dynamics of development that supported rather than displaced existing communities. Oliver became his unofficial research partner, developing mapping and documentation methods that helped communities identify and build on their existing strengths. Aurelia's role had evolved as well. The legal and financial consequences of breaking her corporate partnerships had been significant, but manageable, and she'd used her remaining assets to establish a nonprofit organization that provided low-interest loans to property owners who committed to community-centered development practices. Her work had attracted attention from policymakers and urban planners who were beginning to recognize that stable, affordable housing required approaches that treated residents as partners rather than just revenue sources. On a warm evening in Auway of Vaughan evening, late summer, the three of them sat on the roof garden that Mrs. Rodriguez had designed and that had become a model for similar projects throughout the neighborhood. The space had evolved over 2 years into something that served multiple functions: food production, community gathering space, and demonstration site for sustainable urban agriculture practices. "I got a letter from the city council," Aurelia said, pulling a folded document from her jacket pocket. "They want to nominate our work for a National Community Development Award." Oliver looked up from the tomato plants he was watering. What would that mean? Recognition. Probably some funding for expansion. Definitely more visitors wanting to understand how we did what we did. Ronan considered the implications. "Do you want that kind of attention?" "I want other Mrs. Chuns to be able to stay in their homes," Aurelia replied. "I want other kids like Oliver to grow up in neighborhoods where they know they belong. If attention helps make that possible, then yes, I want it." As the sun set over the city, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reflected off the windows of buildings throughout the neighborhood, Oliver pulled out his current mapping project, a comprehensive documentation of community development strategies that were working in neighborhoods across the city. "You know what I've learned?" he said, settling cross-legged on the wooden bench they'd built from reclaimed materials. "Community isn't something that just happens to people. It's something people choose to create, one conversation at a time, one decision at a time, one person choosing to stay and help instead of leaving or taking." Ronan looked around at the garden, the building, the neighborhood that had become more home than any place he'd ever lived. 3 years ago, he'd been a night shift security guard whose biggest aspiration was keeping his small family stable and safe. Now he was part of work that was changing how entire communities approach development and belonging. "What do you think your grandmother would say about all this?" Aurelia asked Oliver. Oliver smiled, the expression carrying both sadness for what he'd lost and gratitude for what he'd found. "She always said that the most important thing you can teach someone is how to see the best in people and then help them become that." I think she'd say we've all been good students. As they cleaned up their gardening tools and prepared to head inside, Ronan reflected on the path that had brought them to this moment. It had started with Oliver's whispered warning about hidden danger, continued through Aurelia's choice to listen rather than control, and evolved into something none of them could have predicted, a demonstration that development could build community rather than destroying it, that profit could coexist with people-centered values. That home was something people created together, rather than something they simply occupied. The porch light at Brookstone Apartments still burned every night, but now it was one of dozens throughout the neighborhood, a network of beacons that announced not just that people lived in these buildings, but that they had chosen to build something together that was larger and stronger than what any of them could create alone. Inside their apartment, Oliver added one final note to his mapping project before closing his laptop for the night. Home, the place where people choose to stay and take care of each other, and where that choice creates the foundation for everything else that matters. Outside, the city hummed with the energy of millions of people making millions of choices about how to treat each other, how to build together, how to create community in a world that often seemed designed to keep people isolated and competitive. But in one neighborhood, in one building, in one apartment where a man and a boy had chosen to become family, and where a woman had learned to choose people over profit, those choices were creating ripples that spread far beyond what any of them could. Sometimes the smallest whisper really does save everything. And sometimes, when people choose to listen, that whisper becomes a song that others learn to sing. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.